Okay, welcome back to this set of videos on logic and philosophy. My name is Dr. Richard Brown. These videos are primarily for my HEP 112 class that I teach at LaGuardia Community College. In this video, we'll be talking about identifying arguments, which from our textbook is from chapter 1, and this would be section 2. So this is 1.2, and it's on identifying arguments, something that I think that students find challenging. Notice that in the overview video, we distinguish several different types of things which you may find in English, which involve propositions, some which don't involve propositions, but of the ones which do, not all of them are arguments. And I think the best way to really get a handle on this is by looking at examples. So as usual, these examples come from the textbook, and I only go over the ones in my videos for which the answers are given in the textbook, so as to reserve the ones for which there are no answers for use in class as quizzes and other sorts of things like that. Okay, so here is again exercise 1.2 from the textbook. So here's a first example. The turkey vulture is called by that name because its red featherless head resembles the head of a wild turkey. So you look at this, you have to ask yourself, is this an argument? Well, one way you can try to distinguish whether it's an argument is you see the word because right there. And because sometimes indicates something like that, but clearly you might want to ask yourself, if that is the premise, and therefore the conclusion is the turkey vulture is called that name by that name, you might want to substitute therefore in there and see if it works. So the turkey vulture's red featherless head resembles the head of a turkey, therefore it is called that name. Well, it doesn't seem like that's trying to give you some reason to believe that it is true that the turkey vulture is called that name. And so it seemed like this is not an argument. Well, of the various kinds of non-arguments that we have identified, what kind of non-argument is this? Well, it seems clear. This is one of those ones where an explanation is being given. It's not the case that it is true that the turkey vulture is called that name because its red featherless head resembles the head of a wild turkey. So you may say, look, well, isn't that giving me some, excuse me, what did I say before? Yes, isn't this giving me some reason to believe that it's true that the turkey vulture is called that name because of the way that its head looks. So that's looks like you're presenting an evidence. This is the evidence for it looking that way. But that's actually not what's going on here, because turkey vultures, I guess it's commonly assumed that they are named because of their resemblance to turkeys, and so that this is supposed to be something that is not common knowledge. But as with all explanations really are the trickiest ones for people to get, because many people take the criteria that's introduced in the book that an explanation has to be distinguished from an argument by the fact that it's general knowledge. A lot of people wonder, well, okay, what if it's, does that mean that whether it's an argument, it depends on whether I know something or whether I should, in some sense, know something? And that seems to be the case. Something is an argument when you're trying to establish that something is true. So you're trying to establish that the turkey vulture is called by that name. If someone didn't believe you, no, that is why it's called by that name, because look at its head. So if someone were questioning you, you may be trying to convince them that it is true by giving this, but that generally isn't what would be going on here. We would say that someone's not demanding for evidence or proof that turkey vultures are called by that name. Rather, this seems to be shedding light or unpacking, or in other words, trying to explain why it is that turkey vultures have that name. What explains it is that they resemble wild turkeys. So the explanandum here is that the turkey vultures have that name, and the explanans in this case is that they have a head which resembles the wild turkey. Okay, so let's do another example. So a mammal is a vertebrate animal that nurses its offspring. Thus, cats and dogs are mammals, as are sheep, monkey, rabbits, and bears. Okay, so the word thus is there, so you may think that this indicates a conclusion, but of course that would be a mistake. That's a trap in this case. This is not an argument. And in fact, what we can see here is that this is some kind of illustration. So what they're trying to do is illustrate the concept of what it is to be a mammal, a vertebrate animal that nurses its offspring. Um, uh, this isn't, again, trying to establish that it is in fact true that mammals are vertebrates that nurse their offsprings. Rather, they're trying to give you examples or to illustrate what it is that, what kind of things are mammals. So that's a very different kind of thing. All right, so another example. If stem cell research is restricted, then future cures will not materialize. If future cures do not materialize, then people will die prematurely. Therefore, if stem cell research is restricted, then people will die prematurely. Okay, so we have a different kind of case going on here. This is clearly an example of an argument. The word therefore gives it away in this case, indicating that the conclusion is if stem cell research is restricted, then people will die prematurely. The other two sentences are the premises of this argument. So representing it in standard form, we would number the premises. So now I'm sort of switching to the more standard form, and the way I would do it, just leaving P1, leaving the P off, and just numbering the premise. So the first premise, following it in the order that is there in the text, if stem cell research is restricted, then future cures will not materialize. The second premise there, following the second sentence, if future cures do not materialize, then people will die prematurely. We have the line, the solid line. Remember, this didn't really render correctly, but it's supposed to be a solid line there, indicating that what comes next is the conclusion, and that takes the place of our capital letter C before that we used to indicate it. There are multiple ways to indicate the conclusion. So we already said what it was. If stem cell research is restricted, then people will die prematurely. So now we've represented this argument in standard form, and that will tell us, we can look at it to see whether it's valid or not. We will learn later that this argument is valid. This is an example of a pure hypothetical syllogism, and we will talk more about those kinds of arguments in the future, but now you see one actually in the text. So let's do some further examples. So here, what about this example? 5 college students who were accused of sneaking into the Cincinnati Zoo and trying to ride the camels pleaded no contest to criminal trespass yesterday. The students scaled a fence to get into the zoo and then climbed another fence to get into the camel pit before security officials caught them, zoo officials said. Now, in case you couldn't tell from my newscaster voice that I was using, this is not an argument. This is instead a report. So they're not here trying to show you that something is true because of something else. They're just reporting to you that something is the case. So these are propositions, but this is the mere reporting of something. There's no reason to think that there's any kind of argument here. Okay, so let's look at another example from the chemistry textbook. They apparently really like these chemistry textbooks. So in a unit of length, when cubed, becomes a unit of volume. Thus, the cubic meter, cubic centimeter, and cubic millimeter are all units of volume. Okay, so it's a bit similar to an example that we've already discussed, but we see the word thus right there. And so we may think, if we're just sort of being automatic scanners for syntax, we see a conclusion indicator. We think, is this indicating a conclusion? The answer is no. This is not an argument. This is, again, a kind of illustration. So they're just telling you, they're showing you how it is that you can cube a unit of length and it becomes a unit of volume. So cubic meter, and they're giving you examples of those things. So illustrations are not arguments, and they are not trying to establish the truth of the claim that in a unit of length, when cubed becomes a unit of volume. What they're trying to do is to show you, to illustrate how that is done. Okay, so what about this case? Bear one thing in mind before you begin to write your paper. Famous literary works, especially works regarded as classics, have been thoroughly studied to the point where prevailing opinion on them has assumed the character of orthodoxy. Okay, I'm not even really sure what that means. But it's pretty clear to me that there's no argument there. This is not an argument. This is um, uh, a piece of advice. They're just telling you to bear something in mind. That seems like my slides are messing up here, so you didn't see that last thing, but that was just a piece of advice. They were telling you to bear something in mind, and they're not giving an argument, recommending something to you. Okay, so here's another example. For organisms at the sea surface, sinking into deep water usually means death. Plant cells cannot photosynthesize in dark depths. Fishes and other animals that descend lose contact with the main source of food supply, the main surface food supply, and themselves become food for strange, deep living predators. Okay, so that's from Marine Life in the Sea. And that there, it does to me look like an argument. And in fact, the conclusion of this argument is the very first sentence. That's the pattern that we identified in the previous section. For organisms at the sea surface, sinking into deep water usually means death. So we can then identify the other things as premises. So premise 1 here says that plant cells cannot photosynthesize in the dark depths. And the second premise is that other sentence there, fishes and other animals that descend lose contact with the main surface food supply and themselves become food for strange, deep living predators. Now remember, it looks like there are two sentences there. The second sentence, really, if you want to make it into a third premise and say fishes and other animals that descend become food, themselves become food for strange, deep living predators, you might be able to do that. To me, it seems better to leave them together in this way because the ideas are related, and that's the way the person has presented it in the actual English. So then that's all that there is. So now we represent the therefore, and here is the conclusion. For organisms at the sea surface, sinking into deep water usually means death. So this is what we do when we represent an argument in standard form. We do it the same way every time. We identify the argument, then we try to find the argument's conclusion, then we identify the argument's premises, we number the premises, we indicate by some conventional means what the conclusion is, and write it that way. So we've been using this line, make it look like a math problem in a sense. There are other ways. You could put 3 dots down there, write QED, write a capital C with a colon. So any kind of indicator that the conclusion is the thing which is being supported. That really is the important point. Okay, so let's look at another example from physics book, Principle of Physics, 2nd edition. Atoms are the building blocks of all matter. They combine to form molecules whose properties are generally very different from those of the constituent atoms. Table salt, for example, a simple chemical compound formed from chlorine and sodium, resembles neither the poisonous gas nor the highly reactive metal. Okay, so you may look at this, you say, you see the words for example there, so is this a kind of illustration, passage, or is there an argument here? Well, in fact, this is an argument. So the conclusion here is that atoms can combine to form molecules whose properties are generally very different from those of the constituent atoms. And so then they are trying to show that this is true by giving the example of table salt, which is combined from things whose properties it doesn't really resemble. So we may now represent the premises. Premise 1, atoms are the basic building blocks of all matter. Premise 2, table salt, for example, a single chemical compound formed from chlorine and sodium, resembles neither the poisonous gas nor the highly reactive metal. Then we're going to have our conclusion indicator. And now you may wonder, well, what's that first sentence there? Atoms are the basic building blocks of all matter. Is it really doing anything? Does the inference go through with just the second premise? I think that's a good question, and one that we can talk about if you're interested in it. But there's no harm, at least in classical logic, there's no harm in including the extra premise, even if the inference doesn't really depend on it. It's still a valid argument. One of the properties that classical logic has is that a valid argument remains valid even if you add non-essential premises. That's one of the properties which you can prove that classical logic has, and which we will rely on later on when we do some stuff in the class. So is this really part of the argument? I don't know. It's a proposition. Atoms are the basic building blocks of all matter. And it does seem to have something to do with the later claim that they can be recombined into different ultimate elements. but it's not clear that it really is playing a role in the inference. I'm not sure. Actually, I don't think it's harmful to have it there, so I include it as one of the premises. Um, but again, it's kind of one of these points where when you're putting an argument in the standard form, there are these delicate questions. Do I include this? Do I not include that? If you're not sure if it's a proposition, you may as well include it because it won't make the argument invalid. If there's a valid argument there, the argument remains valid even if you include an irrelevant premise. Which this may just be introducing the general subject matter. Someone may come along and say, well, look here, this first sentence is kind of just expository, introducing the topic. It's really, the argument really comes with the second sentence. That's the first premise. Okay, maybe, but it's not wrong to do it this way. And taking another example then, let's see, is it coming here? Ah, there it comes, okay. So this is biochemistry. Okay, so you see lots of arguments made in textbooks, which are good sources for these sorts of things. Excuse me. And we're not even sure if this is an argument yet, so I shouldn't really have said that. Lots of examples taken from the textbooks is what I really should have said. Okay, so it is usually easy to decide whether or not something is alive. This is because living things share many common attributes, such as the capacity to extract energy from nutrients to drive their various functions, the power to actively respond to changes in their environment, and the ability to grow, to differentiate, and to reproduce. Okay, so we see the sentence, this is because, or the phrase, this is because. So you may be thinking to yourself, aha, is this an argument? If it were, the conclusion would be it is usually easy to decide whether or not something is alive. But this is not an argument. Because you don't really need to convince somebody that it's usually easy to decide whether or not something is alive. I mean, think about it. If someone came up to you and said, it is usually easy to decide whether or not something is alive, you may look at them and say, okay, and yes, I'm aware it's usually easy to decide whether or not something is alive. So what's going on here is that they are trying to give an explanation of this fact. Why is it the case that it's so usually easy to decide whether or not something is alive? Well, because they share many attributes like extracting energy from nutrients to drive functions, the power to actively respond to change in the environment. Those are easy to spot. Ability to grow, differentiate, and reproduce. So again, the difference between an explanation and an argument is really tricky. And a lot of students, when they first come to this, really find it hard to distinguish. And I think some of it has to do with this general knowledge claim. The other thing that it has to do with, though, is that people don't spend enough time trying to figure out, well, is this passage trying to convince me of something or something different? And this, if you thought about that for a second, you will see this passage isn't trying to convince you of something. We've already been over that. It's not the case that it's difficult to decide whether something is alive or not. So that's supposed to be kind of obvious. What they're trying to do is shed light on that. Okay, so let's take another example here from B.F. Skinner, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. B.F. Skinner, champion of determinism and behaviorism. Okay, a person never becomes truly self-reliant, even though he deals effectively with things. He is necessarily dependent upon those who have taught him to do so. It's non-gender neutral language there, I guess. Even though he or she deals with effectively with things. Okay, anyway, we could replace all that language, but that's what he wrote. They have selected the things he is dependent upon and determined the kinds and degrees of dependencies. Okay, so there's an argument there. That's clearly an argument. And the conclusion that Skinner is trying to establish that a person never becomes truly self-reliant. So what are the premises? So we can slightly edit this. Even though a person deals effectively with things, he is necessarily dependent upon those who have taught him to do so, him or her. These people who have taught you have selected the things that you are dependent upon and determined the kinds and degrees of the dependencies. And then so the claim is that therefore a person never becomes truly self-reliant. Now remember, we're not saying that you should agree with this conclusion. What we're saying is that if someone says something to you and you disagree with it, then they're either just stating their opinion or they're trying to convince you to agree with them, in which case they may be committing some kind of rhetorical move, like bullying you or appealing to authority or something, or they may be trying to give you an argument. And that's where our class kicks in. If they're trying to give you an argument, then you want to figure out what the structure of that argument is, because after that, you want to really become critical of what the structure is. Is it a valid argument? Does it give me, if these premises were true, would it give me a good reason to believe that the conclusion is true? And so even if you disagree with what Skinner is saying here, well, representing the argument in standard form now allows us to come back and say, aha, well, how could I disagree with Skinner? Well, maybe I would disagree with the first premise or second premise or the structure of the argument in general, so that is the purpose we're eventually going to be building up to being able to do these various other kinds of things. But at this beginning level, what we're trying to do is work our way towards that by first beginning very clear about what standard form is and how it is that you take something from English and try to represent it in that standard form. Okay, so let's do another example here. And this one comes from another psychology textbook. Okay, so in areas where rats are a problem, it is very difficult to exterminate them with bait poison. That's because some rats eat enough poison to die, but others eat only enough to become sick and then learn to avoid that particular poison taste in the future. Okay. This is another interesting discovery that some psychologists have made, this taste aversion here. These animals pick up this habit even though it's often the sickness comes after the taste, which was for a while thought to be contrary to what these kind of conditioning experiments should be showing us. But that's a different issue if we were talking more about the empirical details. Some interesting history here. But here we can see, we'll ask ourselves the question, is this an argument or not? And in fact, this is one of those ones that's you can interpret it either way. So it's not clear from just what is said in the passage here whether it's an argument or an explanation. So if it is kind of common knowledge, then you could be explaining why it's difficult to exterminate rats with poison. However, you could, if someone were dubious of this, you could be trying to convince them that it were the case. And if that were so, then there would be an argument here. So this is sadly just the position that we're in. It's not always 100% clear whether you should interpret a given passage as an explanation or as an argument. If in doubt, you can simply kind of say, well, if this were an argument, then these would be the premises and that would be the conclusion. If this were an explanation, that would be the explanans and these would be the explanandum or whatever. And so if this were interpreted as an argument, then we could say the premises are that some rats eat enough poison to die. The second premise is that other rats eat only enough to become sick and then learn to avoid that particular poison taste in the future. And then say, well, therefore, we think it is also true that in areas where rats are a problem, it is very difficult to exterminate them with bait poison. So now notice this is again one of those ones where it's not clear whether you need the first premise or not. Some rats eat enough poison to die, but you may as well include it because this is what the person said, and it may be necessary for the entailment, and it's never going to be a problem if it's not necessary. So it's fine to include that. And we'll end there. Thank you very much.